I now have great pleasure in introducing the final speaker of our conference, John Scrivener. John is very well known to many of us, having been a trustee of the Prayer Book Society for 11 years and having edited Faith and Worship for 15 years. In his professional life, he was for many years a bookseller. He continues that in another capacity because he's also the chairman of PBS Trading, although of course he's not making any money out of that. But he is also currently a part-time English literature lecturer in the continuing education department of Liverpool University. Over to you, John.
A man who has not read Homer is like a man who has not seen the ocean. There is a great object of which he has no idea. Thus Walter Bagehot in one of his essays. The Book of Common Prayer is a great object, a great fact, if you will, of which sadly many people now indeed have no idea. But in English life from the second half of the 16th century until the middle of the 20th century, it was unexampled in its reach and continuousness of presence, more widely known than any text, other than the Bible, more frequently performed, even today, than the most popular of plays, and familiar, of course, not only to members of the Church of England, but to dissenters too. Until 1837, after all, no Christian marriage could be solemnised with legal effect, other than in the Church of England. And until 1880, there were many parts of the country where, since the only burial ground was Anglican, only the prayer book burial rite could be used at the interment. So the words of the prayer book had currency, too, among the nonconformists. Moreover, where the prayer book's influence on imaginative literature specifically is concerned, we should, I think, be struck by the number of our important writers who were themselves clergy of the Church of England. George Herbert, John Donne, Jonathan Swift, Lawrence Sterne, George Crabbe, among others. And still more striking, perhaps, is the number of major writers who have been sons and daughters of the clergy. For example, Andrew Marvell, Jane Austen, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Charlotte and Emily Bronte, Lord Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, Lewis Carroll, who of course was in deacon's orders himself. It would be tedious to attempt a list of all such writers, let alone of all writers who have been mere lay people, but it is worth recording that even some of those who drifted away from the faith continued sometimes to attend church, like Thomas Hardy, and that some of our most conspicuous Roman Catholic writers, John Henry Newman, Gerard Manley Hopkins, Evelyn Moore, Graham Greene, were Anglican by upbringing. And in this connection I've always been struck by two others who, though for the most part living their lives at a critical, sometimes a fiercely critical distance from the church, nevertheless requested Church of England funerals: William Blake and George Orwell. Blake was buried in Bunhill Fields, the dissenters' burial ground. In answer to his wife's questions, we are told, he had replied that he did not himself mind where he lay, but it might as well be where others of his family had been buried, and that he would wish the service to be that of the Church of England. In the case of Orwell, his will, made very shortly before his death, requested that he be buried according to the rites of the Church of England in the nearest convenient churchyard to wherever he should die. His wishes were carried out, not without difficulty, by his executors, and he was buried at Sutton Courtenay in Oxfordshire through the influence of David Astor. The vicar, G.R. Dunstan, who was later a very distinguished moral theologian, agreed to this with the proviso that he must have the consent of his two wardens. One of these, a local farmer, is said to have been initially reluctant, but came round on being told that the man who was to be buried had written a book called Animal Farm. So this penetration and presence in English life of the prayer book, this existence as a great object, seems to set up a huge presumption, prima facie, in favour of the influence of the BCP on our culture. But we ought to enter a couple of caveats, I think. Firstly, of course, the idea of influence on a culture, so easy and natural to us, would have been puzzling to the men of the 16th century. It might easily have suggested occult planetary influences on crops or husbandry. Had we succeeded in explaining the concept, it would not have appeared to them, perhaps, something to be aimed at. Scribner undoubtedly showed great literary skill in fashioning the first English liturgies, but his object plainly was, in his own words, the setting forth of God's honour and glory, and the promotion of a most perfect and godly living. Insofar as the Book of Common Prayer has successfully done these things, it will have influenced the religious and moral tone of our literature. But an influence of this kind is essentially incalculable. It will have been, to borrow a phrase of George Eliot's, incalculably diffusive. And I think the same might be said of the influence on the language. I think there is a deep influence on the language by the prayer book over a long period, but it's a very difficult thing, an elusive thing to pin down. The question has been confronted head-on by Ian Robinson in his book Cranmer's Sentences, which I recommend to you. Cranmer is the great maker of our modern prose, but as another speaker has pointed out, he was part of a continuity. He brought to a kind of perfection styles of religious English which have had some degree of continuity going right back to the Anglo-Saxon times. He brought it to a sort of perfection, and of course he also gave it, because of the legal enforcement of the prayer book, a fixity. It became a permanent feature of life, and so influenced liturgical English and other English. But this is the work of time. If you read the Elizabethan prayers that were issued by injunction from time to time, they compare very badly with the prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. They are rather diffuse and rambling in the way that some other Elizabethan prose is. It took time for this very concise, weighty prose of the prayer book to take full effect on the language. And of course it's refracted through innumerable other stylistic influences over time. And perhaps it should be said that influence is a tricky concept in any case. And it was perhaps natural that the old idea of a sort of intangible planetary emanation should be developed with a wider application. There is a saying of the historian Butler that the objection to generalizations respecting the development of the intellect of a nation is not that they want certainty, but that they lack precision. We may feel certain that an influence is real without being able to specify how it has worked with any great precision. But the prayer book has had a shaping influence on English life, language and literature. It seems an irresistible proposition, but attempts to illustrate it tend to content themselves with a few well-worn examples. My proposal is to look at the presence of the Book of Common Prayer in the work of some of our best novelists, and to consider what, if anything, we can learn from it. There have been prose narratives and fictions for millennia, of course, but the rise of the novel in the modern sense has been identified with the English 18th century novelists Defoe, Richardson and Fielding, and was so identified as an English phenomenon by French writers, such as Rousseau, Diderot and Madame de Staël, for example. The details of that history don't concern us here, but as the new form came to maturity with the great novelists of the 19th century, its expressive possibilities became so wide that it became the preeminent literary genre, and not only in this country, of course. The novelist can move freely between descriptions of outward surroundings, whether in or out of doors, and the inward thoughts and sensations of individual characters. He can report dialogue, but also describe the accompanying tones and gestures of those conversing. He can, by a multiplicity of means, create, in short, an immersive and convincing experience which seems real, true to life, and so on. Of course, this is not a simple achievement, and there will be much to say in another context as to the subtle ways in which writers managed to create this effect. The rise of the novel to preeminence runs from roughly the mid-18th century to the present day, though it may be that the greatest and most characteristic realist novels in English are those of the mid-Victorian period. So what follows obviously isn't going to be exhaustive, and you might have many favourite examples yourself of the kind of phenomena I'm describing. But I believe that the kinds of ways in which the prayer book appears in English novels, which I describe, are probably fairly representative. Firstly, we find many passing verbal references to the BCP, quotations, allusions, sometimes adaptations. At the flattest end, as it were, a novelist may write, this is from one of George Hare's historical novels, "The King's Arms was owned by Thomas Cribb, champion heavyweight of England. All sorts and conditions of men, from titled gentlemen to coal heavers, frequented it." All sorts and conditions of men. This is the minimal use. It's close to the use of idioms. The author may know where it comes from. The reader needn't. Similar phrases would be "out of an invisible sign," or a favourite with schoolmasters in my youth, "read, mark, learn, and immediately digest." These uses more or less lack any charge from the original context. More edged are those quotations which are used for ironic purposes, the irony being directed not against the prayer book words, but against the personal action accompanying them, as when the wedding vows are quoted in ironic counterpoint to the loveless Dombey marriage in Dombey and Son, or when in Joseph Conrad's great novel Chance, the ruined speculator and conman de Barral complains that he is the victim of envy, malice, and all uncharitableness. Or when the son, in John le Carré's Single and Single, who has been inveigled by his financier father into a particularly dirty money laundering operation, is teased and suborned. Quote, "If you stand 5'3" in your lob's raised heels, and if your son is 6'3", it is only natural that you should wish to bring him down to scale in front of others, and only meet, right, and Oliver's bounden duty that he should collaborate in this reduction." Sometimes the irony cuts both ways, as in the description of the unloved Sir Pitt Crawley's funeral in Vanity Fair, whose funeral train includes, quote, "the family in black coaches with their handkerchiefs up to their noses, ready for the cheers which did not come, the undertaker and his gentlemen in deep tribulation, the select tenantry mourning out of compliment to the new landlord, the neighbouring gentry's carriages at 3 miles an hour, empty and in profound affliction, the parson speaking out the formula about our dear brother departed. As long as we have a man's body, we play our vanities on it, surrounding it with humbug and ceremonies, laying it in state and packing it up in gilt nails and velvet, and we finish our duties by placing over it a stone written all over with lies." The deceased here, Sir Pitt Crawley, has been a degenerate old scoundrel, and hardly anyone's dear brother. But the description, of course, also attacks, in some degree, the convention of using the same formula, regardless of the merits of the deceased, which is no argument, of course, about the prayer book burial service. We ought to add to this list, too, the use of prayer book phrases as novel titles. Walter Besant's All Sorts and Conditions of Men, Agatha Christie's N or M, and P.D. James' Devices and Desires, and no doubt many others. Probably not much is lost in these cases if the reader doesn't recognise the source. There is another class of borrowings where there would be a loss. Those cases where a BCP phrase is deliberately misquoted, or reversed, or varied for parodic or humorous purposes, as when Captain Cuttle in Dombey and Son mangles the definition of a sacrament in the Catechism, or when Leopold Bloom in Joyce's Ulysses reverses the prayer books "in the midst of life we are in death" to become "in the midst of death we are in life," not inappropriately for a man walking through a very large cemetery, or when Rose Macaulay transforms "in choirs and places where they sing" into "in drawing rooms and places where they chat." Sometimes one is unsure whether there is an illusion or not. In Mansfield Park, for example, the Price family leave their somewhat chaotic household to attend morning service at the Garrison Chapel. They're looking their best. Sunday, Jane Austen says, made her a very creditable and tolerably cheerful-looking Mrs. Price, coming abroad with a fine family of children, feeling a little respite of her weekly cares, and only discomposed if she saw her boys run into danger or Rebecca pass by with a flower in her hat. Is run into danger a conscious echo of never run into any kind of danger from morning prayer, which they have been attending, or is it just an unconscious tug, as it were, from the context? One can't be sure. Similarly, this isn't in a novel, when John Ruskin writes in his Elements of Drawing of using crumbs of bread to erase faults in drawing, he writes that besides, you waste the good bread, which is wrong, and your drawing will not for a long while be worth the crumbs. One finds oneself wondering whether some faint reminiscence of the prayer of humble access is not somewhere about in the association of crumbs and worthiness and the correction of faults, or is one imagining things? At any rate, fleeting verbal allusions to and quotations from the prayer book are certainly very common in novels, but in many cases they aren't doing work much different from what they're called to do in ordinary non-fictional prose. And often enough, no doubt, they are used for not much more than a rather specious kind of decoration. Sometimes the prayer book is referred to as a book, the physical volume itself. Consider this from Vanity Fair, on Mr. Osborne's library. From year's end to year's end, he never took one of these volumes from the shelf, except upon those rare Sunday evenings when there was no dinner party, and when the great Scarlet Bible and prayer book were taken out from the corner where they stood, beside his copy of the Peerage, and the servants being rung up to the dining parlour, Osborne read the evening service to the family in a loud, grating, pompous voice. No comment is necessary. The more complex is the moment in Philip Larkin's A Girl in Winter. The female protagonist, Catherine, is returning someone's handbag, which has been left in a shop. She is invited in by Miss Parbury, who makes tea for her. Miss Parbury lives with her bedridden invalid mother, whom she looks after. It emerges in the course of conversation that she has a suitor who will only marry her if she puts the mother in a home. At one point, Catherine looks around the room while her hostess is in the kitchen, where she could be heard rattling spoons and saucers and singing what sounded like a hymn. There was a small Book of Common Prayer lying on the sideboard, bound in crimson. The hymn and the prayer book focus her dilemma using a kind of shorthand. It is really her duty, and she feels it so, to care for the ailing mother, but on the other hand, there is the chance of happiness. The scene is sad, gesturing towards the kind of hidden lives whose depiction in Barbara Pym's novels Larkin so much admired. I recently came across a commentary on this which suggested that the prayer book was specified in contempt of the ugly, boring life being led here, and that Larkin meant lying, in lying on the sideboard, punningly, that the book was a lying book, a mendacious book. This seems to be monstrously unlikely. The illusion seems to me respectable, if rather depressed. Of course, words from the book and the physical book can be combined. In Charles Dickens's Little Dorrit, Mr. Dorrit returns to his room in the Marshalsea prison, where his daughter awaits him with a meal. It is Sunday evening. There the table was laid for his supper, and his old grey gown was ready for him on his chair back on the fire, at the fire. His daughter put her little prayer book in her pocket. Had she been praying for pity on all prisoners and captives, and rose to welcome him? This brief moment precedes that great and painfully moving scene in which old Dorrit comes to a momentary self-realization. He has been 20 years in the debtor's prison and has built up a kind of self-protective fiction of himself as the father of the Marshalsea, receiver of honourable testimonials and universal respect. The facade collapses because he finds himself hinting to his daughter that she should lead on the turnkey's son, who has fallen in love with her, so as to avoid any unpleasant consequences to himself. She remains lovingly silent, and by sheer force of being what she is, brings on a terrible glimpse of himself as a squalid, disgraced wretch. The preliminary mention of the prayer book and the quote from the litany discreetly intimate, without emphasizing, her Christian inspiration. The quiet putting aside of the book, its lack of ostentation, might be said to incarnate in a true form the virtues enjoined in the Catechism: love and succour towards her father, submission, lowliness and reverence, labour and duty. She is not only the child of the Marshalsea, but a child of the Catechism. But Dickens's art in this novel makes her seem possible, even natural, to my mind at least. His art in handling her multiple relations and endowing her with a kind of passive power. And yet, thinking that, one also thinks, and this is characteristic of Dickens, that the same characteristics can appear in a kind of horrific, grotesque and parodic form. Think of Uriah Heep in David Copperfield. How very humble he is, how very deferential he is to his betters, but this a cloak, of course, for malice and a wish to do ill. He too is a child of the Catechism. To order myself lowly and reverently to all my betters is what he pretends to do. So this is already an intimation that in the novel, the prayer book isn't just, or its catechism or any part of the prayer book isn't just something that exists in itself. It exists as it is refracted through different consciousnesses and different possibilities of human life. Dickens is perhaps the greatest of our novelists, so perhaps I might offer a digression on his relation to the church and to the prayer book particularly. He was an Anglican by upbringing, of course, and though he for a time attended a Unitarian chapel out of admiration of the minister, he remained Anglican, essentially. He was a very untheological and undogmatic Christian, standing by the Jesus of the Gospels as he understood him, and having a great dislike of church quarrels and divisions. His works abound, of course, in religious hypocrites and in parodies of their lamentable jargon. Think of Mr. Chadband. His picture of the established church is less hostile, but church buildings are often depicted as rotting and dilapidated, and the clergy as somewhat irrelevant, if sometimes kindly. The exception is Mr. Milby in Dickens's last novel, Our Mutual Friend, the sympathetic but harassed vicar of a demanding parish, whose parochial duties are realistically portrayed, and whose voice is not untroubled when reading over the grave of the heroic Betty Higden the words of the burial service: "We give thee hearty thanks, for it hath pleased thee to deliver this our sister out of the miseries of this sinful world." Not untroubled, because of the circumstances of the case and the thoughtless way in which the words may be read. In fact, references to the prayer book and its services are quite common in Dickens, and often dwell on the question of our right relation to the words of the liturgy. There is this, for example, from David Copperfield. "Again the dreaded Sunday comes round, and I file into the old pew first, like a guarded captive brought to a condemned service. Again Miss Murdstone, in a black velvet gown that looks as if it had been made out of a pall, follows close upon me, then my mother, then her husband. Again I listen to Miss Murdstone mumbling the responses and emphasizing all the dread words with a cruel relish. Again I see her dark eyes roll round the church when she says, 'miserable sinners,' as if she were calling all the congregation names. Again I catch rare glimpses of my mother moving her lips timidly between the two, with one of them muttering at each ear like low thunder. Again I wonder with a sudden fear whether it is likely that our good old clergyman can be wrong, and Mr. and Miss Murdstone right, and that all the angels in heaven can be destroying angels. Again, if I move a finger or relax a muscle of my face, Miss Murdstone pokes me with her prayer book and makes my side ache. The prayer book and its words have been weaponized here. It's directed against others rather than inward. And then there's this from Dombey and Son at the christening of young Paul, the son of Dombey and Son. Then the clergyman, an amiable, this is the christening of Paul, the clergyman, an amiable and mild-looking young curate, but obviously afraid of the baby, appeared like the principal character in a ghost story, a tall figure all in white, at sight of whom Paul rent the air with his cries and never left off again until he was taken out black in the face. Even when that event had happened, to the great relief of everybody, he was heard under the portico during the rest of the ceremony, now fainter, now louder, now hushed, now bursting forth again with an irrepressible sense of his wrongs. This so distracted the attention of the two ladies that Mrs. Chick was constantly deploying into the centre aisle to send out messages by the pew opener, while Miss Tox kept her prayer book open at the gunpowder plot and occasionally read responses from that service. During the whole of these proceedings, Mr. Dombey remained as impassive and gentlemanly as ever, and perhaps assisted in making it so cold that the young curate smoked at the mouth as he read. The only time that he unbent his visage in the least was when the clergyman, in delivering, very unaffectedly and simply, the closing exhortation relative to the future examination of the child by the sponsors, happened to rest his eye on Mr. Chick, who is one of the godparents. And then Mr. Dombey might have been seen to express my majestic look, that he would like to catch him at it. It might have been well, Dickens continues, for Mr. Dombey if he had thought of his own dignity a little less, and had thought of the great origin and purpose of the ceremony in which he took so formal and so stiff a part a little more. His arrogance contrasted strangely with its history. Criticism here obviously is directed at Dombey, and not at the amiable curate, who reads very unaffectedly and simply, and not at the service itself. Dickens makes something of a motif in this novel of the occasional offices, as christening succeeds funeral and funeral christening, and both are succeeded by the second marriage of Dombey. We are reminded that these same events have taken place in the same church, emphasising Dickens's desire here to effect a kind of interweaving of life and death. And we should remember that elsewhere in the same novel, the simple and good-hearted Captain Cuttle, on learning of the supposed death of Walter Gay at sea, put on his spectacles and opened the prayer book at the burial service, reading softly to himself in the little back parlour, and stopping now and then to wipe his eyes, in a true and simple spirit, committed Walter's body to the deep. And that the same Captain Cuttle, later in the novel, reads out of a prayer book the forms of prayer appointed to be read at sea, and being heartily in earnest, read the service to the very last line, and with genuine feeling too, and approving of it very much when he had done, turned in, under the counter, with a serene breast and most benevolent visage. In Dickens, then, I suggest the services become a kind of test of one's sincerity, of one's heart. And this applies too to negligence and artificiality are deplored, and there is a world of difference between the clergyman at a pauper's funeral in Oliver Twist, who reads, quote, as much of the burial service as could be compressed into 4 minutes. And the clergyman described in one of his occasional pieces, Sunday Under Three Heads. The impressive service of the Church of England was spoken, not merely read, by a grey-headed minister, and the responses delivered by his auditors with an air of sincere devotion, as far removed from affectation or display as from coldness or indifference. The discourse was plain, unpretending, and well adapted to the comprehension of the hearers. This is evidently something like Dickens's ideal. What we note importantly in Dickens is a new freedom, which is the freedom of the novel as a form. In depicting services and in noting the thoughts, the inattentions, the incidentals of public worship, and its dramatic possibilities. I suppose the most famous dramatic effect of this kind in the novel is in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where you remember that Jane is at the altar with Rochester, and the clergyman has just read the words asking if there is any impediment to the marriage, and these are quoted in full. He paused, as the custom is. When is the pause after that sentence ever broken by reply? Not perhaps once in 100 years. And the clergyman, who had not lifted his eyes from his book, and had held his breath but for a moment, was proceeding. His hand was already stretched towards Mr. Rochester, as his lips unclosed to ask, wilt thou have this woman for thy wedded wife? and a distinct and near voice said, "The marriage cannot go on. I declare the existence of an impediment." It must always have been possible for services to go wrong for one reason or another. But as far as I know, Charlotte Bronte was the first to seize this particular opportunity, and so I suppose should be regarded as the ultimate source for all those scandalous scenes at weddings and funerals which are so beloved by the TV soaps. But what the freedom of the novel involves more than just an account of external mishaps, as it were. It can enter into different consciousnesses, the consciousnesses of those taking part in the service, and it can explore sometimes the most intimate thoughts of the hearts. We see this, I think, developing more in the 20th century novel, where the prayer book is used. I think reticence would have prevented any 19th century novelist from extending this kind of freedom to the service of Holy Communion. But we do have novelists in the 20th century who give us the thoughts of somebody approaching the sacrament, and writers who are not necessarily believers, although the one I'm going to briefly quote, in fact, was, which is Patrick White, who, to my mind, is the greatest post-war novelist in English. Does something like this in Tree of Man. The service is 1662 Holy Communion. The setting is Australian. The book was published in the 1950s, so it has to be 1662. But only the comfortable words are actually quoted. What we have, rather, are the accompanying sensations and thoughts of the three members of the Parker family as they approach the sacrament. The passage is too long to quote in full. Here, for example, is Stan Parker at the rail as he waits to receive the cup, having already received the bread. The light shone on the dust of the carpet, of which the pattern had worn away. Weariness was almost bliss. The flowers of the vases were so taut, so tight, that only a law of nature was preventing them from flying apart from strength of their own stillness. The words were falling like precious blood as the priest brought the cup to each. There was nothing between them now except his large wrists. The cup and the words dissolved most mercifully, so that with some who were particularly grateful and ashamed of themselves, the wine gurgled hotly at the back of their throats. This is a bold kind of writing which incorporates the scent and is not reticent about incorporating the physical sensations and that moment at communion where perhaps thought itself is excluded. There's a kind of a moment, as it were, an enduring moment. It really is incarnational writing, but this is a kind of novel and a kind of depiction of a service which we can't possibly imagine Jane Austen, for example, favoured, or I think any 19th century novels. And there are scenes in other novels. I'm thinking of the opening of George Orwell's not very successful novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, which begins with the daughter attending an early communion service and alludes to the words of the service as her thoughts and sensations are described. I want to turn to Jane Austen's Mansfield Park and to George Eliot's Silas Marner as two particularly key examples, which are going to be my concluding examples, I suppose, really. Because I think they're unusual in that the use of the prayer book is centrally intertwined with the themes of the two novels in a way that goes beyond passing allusion or incidental description of one of the church's services. Jane Austen, of course, daughter of a vicar, a family with a number of clergy, and presumably a quietly devout member of the Church of England, rather in the 18th century way, I suppose. Not enthusiastic, as we have to use that word in that context. Rather reticent about religion. Occasionally her characters are effectively praying, but she doesn't use a religious language to describe what's happening exactly. In the letters we have, sadly, only a handful of references to religious questions. But one thing we have to take note of when we're considering Mansfield Park is that we move from her saying in 1809, in one letter, "I do not like the evangelicals," to her comment in 1814, when she is advising on a suitor who has shown evangelical tendencies. "I am by no means convinced that we ought not all to be evangelicals." And that 1814 is when Mansfield Park is being written and completed. And there's a letter in which she has often been taken to be saying that the novel is about ordination. I think this is a misreading of the letter, because I think she's signalling a change of topic within the letter rather than between her last novel and her present novel, Mansfield Park. But nevertheless, ordination does play a part in the novel, because one of the chief characters is going to be ordained. And it's a kind of experimental novel for Jane Austen, I think. She's experimenting with a totally different kind of central figure. Her heroine, Fanny Price, is the opposite pole from Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. She's quiet, rather suppressed. She lives, of course, as the poor relation of Mansfield Park. She's rather serious, rather pious. And from that day to this, people have much disagreed about whether they like Fanny Price or not. One school saying that she's a drip, a prig, at best a mouse, and others finding her much more sympathetic. But she is experimenting by creating a character like this, and experimenting in other ways in the novel too, I think, by using, for example, a kind of symbolism which you don't find in her other novels, I think. So the plot is that Fanny is growing up from the age of about 9, I think, at Mansfield Park with her cousins. Her aunt is married to Sir Thomas Bertram. The Bertram family, this is a place of order, spaciousness, in which she feels slightly repressed and timid, which is presided over by Sir Thomas Bertram, a serious and intelligent and moral man. And it's unusual in Jane Austen in that there is explicit discussion of the liturgy on 2 occasions, which discussions are relevant to the preoccupations of the novel. The first is when a party are going around Southerton, which is the property of Mr. Rushworth. Mr. Rushworth has become engaged, you'll remember, to Maria Bertram, and they're visiting his large property. He's a very wealthy man. And they are shown around the house and come to the chapel. I won't read the whole passage, but it is a handsome chapel, says his mother, Mrs. Rushworth. It was formerly in constant use both morning and evening. Prayers were always read in it by the domestic chaplain, within the memory of many. But the late Mr. Rushworth left it off. And at this point, Mary Crawford, brother and sister, are a new force that is impinging on this family circle. Very enchanting, very witty, very charming. Says of this discontinuance, "Well, every generation has improvements," said Miss Crawford with a smile to Edmund. She doesn't realise yet that Edmund is planning to be ordained. Fanny, of course, reacts quite adversely. "It's a pity," said Fanny, "that the custom should have been discontinued. It was a valuable part of former times. A whole family assembling regularly for the purpose of prayer is fine." "Very fine indeed," said Miss Crawford, laughing. "It must do the heads of the family a great deal of good to force all the poor housemaids and footmen to leave business and pleasure and say their prayers here twice a day, while they are inventing excuses themselves for staying away." And then Edmund remonstrates that this is hardly Fanny's idea. If the master and missus do not attend themselves, there must be more harm than good in the custom. And then Mary argues that it would be much better if people were allowed to simply say their private devotions privately, that to bring them together in this way is onerous and is bound to lead to distraction through the obligation of attendance, the formality, the restraint, the length of time. And she imagines that the daughters of the house would have been seemingly pious, but with heads in reality full of something very different, especially if the poor chaplain were not worth looking at. And the argument continues, and Edmund's main point is that, which is really like Dr. Johnson's point, that something that is not done somewhere may well not be done anywhere. He says that we must all feel at times the difficulty of fixing our thoughts as we could wish, but if you are supposing it a frequent thing, that is to say a weakness grown into a habit from neglect, what could be expected from the private devotions of such persons? Do you think the minds which are suffered, which are indulged in wanderings in a chapel, would be more collected in a closet? The mind does not struggle against itself under one circumstances. It would find objects to distract it in the other, I believe. But he does concede the greater length of the service, however, I admit to be sometimes too hard a stretch upon the mind. This is connected with the main theme because it seems to me that one of the central preoccupations of Mansfield Park is the place you belong to. It's a novel that's preoccupied with order, with when order needs to be open to change, but about how order can become disrupted. And a lot of that is to do with being in your right place. It was evidently a question at the time about clergy residence. Edmund is told by some that he'd be perfectly right if he carries on living at Mansfield Hall and just hacks over to the parish he's taking over to read the service on Sundays. But the contrary view of Sir Thomas and Edmund is that no, this is not right. A resident clergyman is more than just somebody who reads the Sunday service. He is a moral influence in the parish. His very presence there sets an example and allows him to minister pastorally. And that's connected to the problems that arise in the course of the novel when Sir Thomas absents himself from Mansfield. He has another estate in Antigua. He goes there, and in his absence all sorts of things start going wrong at Mansfield Park, in particular to do with the theatricals, when the young people decide to perform lovers' vows. This leads into all sorts of complications and flirtations, which they know that the father would disapprove of, but the father isn't there. And Henry Crawford, the brother of Mary Crawford, is a major player in this, of course. And at one point, he shows an extraordinary versatility. He's reading from one of Shakespeare's plays. He inhabits each part successively with extraordinarily convincing effect, like a kind of chameleon. He takes on each part. And Fanny, whom he's really trying to woo, is actually rather fascinated by this, although she keeps very quiet. And he then broaches a topic, they then broach a topic which he's particularly interested in, because talking of reading, Edmund says, even in my profession, i.e. clergy, how little the art of reading has been studied, how little a clear manner and good delivery have been attended to. I speak rather of the past, however, than the present. There is now a spirit of improvement abroad, but among those who were ordained 20, 30, 40 years ago, the larger number, to judge by their performance, must have thought reading was reading and preaching was preaching. It is different now. The subject is more justly considered. It is felt that distinctness and energy may have weight in recommending the most solid truths. And besides, there is more general observation and taste, more critical knowledge diffused than formerly. In every congregation there is a larger proportion who know a little of the matter and who can judge and criticise. Edmund had already gone through the service once since his ordination. And upon this being understood, he had a variety of questions from Crawford as to his feelings and success. And Crawford starts to ask him about the service and give his own opinions as to the properest manner in which particular passages in the service should be delivered. And then Crawford says, our liturgy, observed Crawford, has beauties which not even a careless, slovenly style of reading can destroy, but it also has redundancies and repetitions which require good reading not to be felt. For myself, at least, I must confess, being not always so attentive as I ought to be, here was a glance at Fanny, that 19 times out of 20 I am thinking how such a prayer ought to be read and longing to have it to read myself. Did you speak? Stepping eagerly to Fanny and addressing her in a softened voice, and upon her saying no, he added, are you sure you did not speak? I saw your lips move. I fancied you might begin to tell me I ought to be more attentive and not allow my thoughts to wander. Are you not going to tell me so? No, indeed, you know your duty too well for me to even suppose it. And then he continues to harass her, as it were, to try and see why she reacts to certain things. He starts talking about sermons and how he would like to preach sermons himself, but He says, I don't know that I should be fond of preaching often. Now and then, perhaps once or twice in the spring, after being anxiously expected for half a dozen Sundays together, but not for a constancy. It would not do for a constancy. And then he again, seeing Fanny shake her head, presses her as to why she has. And she says, perhaps, I thought it was a pity you did not always know yourself as well as you seemed to do at that moment. This is important because it relates, of course, because of this question of the acting that has taken place and has been so disruptive at Mansfield Park, and in which Henry Crawford has been the most brilliant and talented participant. It raises a subtle question about what kind of being one has, what kind of constancy one has, whether inhabiting different parts too readily undermines one's integrity as a self. And the discussion of liturgy and Crawford's part in the discussion of the liturgy, which he sees as largely an opportunity for the deployment of speaking skills, shows us how narrow the margin is between what it is legitimate to say in this novel and what it is suspicious to say, as it were. Because Crawford clearly is considered legitimate to discuss the liturgy and how it should be read. There's something, and it's a fine margin, about Crawford's facility and Crawford's ease in acting, which makes it slightly suspect. And of course that whole question of the fineness of the line between what makes the Crawfords charming and attractive and what makes them slightly suspect is very central to the novel, and centrally constituted on this idea of acting a part that you're not. The other novel I wanted briefly to look at, which again seems to me to make Prem fairly central to its themes, is from George Eliot. Mary Ann Evans, of course. George Eliot, her pen name. Silas Marner. Again, many of you may have read this. George Eliot had a conventional Anglican upbringing, probably not unlike the kind of church upbringing that is reflected in Jane Austen's novels. Then she had, in her young womanhood, a very strong evangelical phase, church evangelical, but evangelical in a way that actually caused problems in the family, because the family, it's rather a question of enthusiasm again. They were used to a more 18th century kind of Anglicanism, if you like, and her very enthusiastic evangelical phase rather disturbed relations within the family. But then that was followed by a further phase in which faith itself was eroded, so that she is one of those honest doubters, which are a feature of the Victorian age. And of course she translated Strauss the German critic, who, as it were, was one of those who deconstructed the New Testament texts and cast doubt on their veracity. This was a painful labour. It's a very long book, and she describes how weary she is with it. And strangely, she had a statue of Christ before her while she was translating this book, which was, as it were, playing its part in the erosion of her orthodox faith. Then later she translates Feuerbach, and that, I think, putting it simply, restored to her the idea that Christianity could play a part in her life in some sense, because Feuerbach's Essence of Christianity is really the book which says our idea of God is a projection. We simply see there what we've projected upwards. What we ought to do is to face up to that and, as it were, bring back what's been projected into our own lives and acknowledge it, acknowledge the truth in the myth, as it were, and make that part of our human lives. That was a kind of faith of George Eliot. The curious thing about George Eliot, of course, is that she continues to have, I would say, essentially a Christian imagination. And because she was using this male pseudonym, George Eliot, many people thought her early novels were actually written by a clergyman, particularly Scenes of Clerical Life, her first collection of fiction. And we know that she read the Bible every day for the rest of her life, in spite of becoming a kind of positivist in her. She was formed to be intellectual, of course, and she was very influenced by Spencer and other writers, but her imagination, I think, did remain in some sense Christian. When she married John Cross after the death of her consort of many years, G.H. Lewis, she was married according to the rites of the Church of England, and she was buried with the service led, I think, by a Unitarian minister, which was the Book of Common Prayer service with what her biographer calls suitable excisions. Trinitarian matter, presumably. So Silas Marner concerns the eponymous hero, who belongs at the outset of the novel to this very narrow sect in an industrial town in the north. I'm not told where exactly. And he is, by a casting of lots, he is expelled from this society, and also expelled from his young love at the same time. And he leaves altogether that community and moves to a country village in George Eliot's native Midlands, it seems, to a village called Raveloe. He sets up as a weaver. A weaver is his craft. But he lives in complete isolation from his fellows, and all his human emotions become fixed on the gold he is gradually amassing. He becomes a kind of miser. And then, I won't remind you of all the plot mechanics, but one day the gold which he gets out to gloat over occasionally is stolen, and almost at the same moment a child with golden hair is left upon his hearth as a foundling, and the mother died outside in the snow. And this is looking after this child whom he adopts becomes his readmission into a human life in society. He ceases to be isolated because the other members of the community approve his adopting the child and see that he's going to need help. He has to accept help. So the give and take begins. And what's striking, I think, about the novel is how centred it all is on the church and the prayer book in this picture of this quite simple community. Because the question comes up, should the child be christened? You don't know that she has been christened. She ought to be christened. Presumably on the assumption that she hasn't been, with the usual qualifications in that case. And as she explains, as Dolly Winthrop, who's his main contact with the village community, explains to him what this means, he's persuaded that it ought to be done. But his idea of the Christian religion is so different from her idea of the Christian religion that it is almost as if they were two different religions. He doesn't really understand what she's talking about. He knows about adult baptism, but he's never heard of Christendom. He doesn't know what that is. And initially there was a kind of gap of comprehension. But Dolly says, you must bring her up like christened folks' children and take her to church and let her learn her catechize, as my little Aaron can say off, the I believe and everything, and hurt nobody by word or deed, as well as if he was the clerk. He's traditionally christened, as I say. And Dolly, he has several conversations with Dolly, and at one point she says, folks in your old country, never saying prayers by heart, nor saying them out of a book. They must be wonderful clever. For if I didn't know our Father, and little bits of good words as I can carry out to church with me, I might go down on my knees every night, but nothing could I say. And Mr. Macy, the clerk, who's a central character, who's the kind of village elder, parish clerk, who of course plays a major part in the services, says that I've been clerk of this parish 40 years, and I know when the parson and me does the cussing of a Ash Wednesday, there's no cussing of folks as have a mind to be cured without a doctor. He's defending the practice of going to herbalists. There's no cussing of folks as have a mind to be cured without a doctor. And so, Master Marner, as I was saying, for there's windings in things as they may carry you to the far end of the prayer book before you get back to them, my advice is, you keep up your spirits. So the practices of the church and the words of the church are represented as being central in this community. And the epi grows up. And a number of years later, therefore, Marner is depicted coming out of church with his adopted daughter, Epi, she's carrying a prayer book wrapped in a handkerchief, and she starts talking to somebody and jumping about, and he says to her, Mana says to her, come, come, let me carry your prayer book, else you'll be dropping it, jumping that way. That's, if you like, is a kind of symbol of his incorporation into the community, that he can now take the prayer book, which when first he was there was a completely meaningless thing to him. He has become part of the community, and that can be symbolised and represented by the position of the prayer book. Of course, the difference with George Eliot is that all this is seen in a way at a kind of sociological distance, almost an anthropological distance, you might say. She sees the value of it in that community, and what novelists are writing about is people who are embedded in particular forms of social life. He sees the value of the church and the prayer book in this form of life, but she does so from a distance of belief herself, which gives it a different feel, I think, from Jane Austen. Well, I'm going to say a few words in conclusion, and I think the conclusions one comes to looking at these and other references to the prayer book in our novels are actually very, very simple and not particularly exciting. But firstly, the pervasive presence of the prayer book is confirmed, I think. Passing allusions and references are very frequent in novels. The rise of the novel came at a time of rapid social change, and the novelists are sensitive to this. But the second point, of course, is that the prayer book, during the period I've particularly been looking at, between the latter end of the 18th century and say the 1870s, is completely unchanging. It is unchanging by legal force. So even though moral feelings, religious feelings, sensibilities are changing, the liturgy remains the same. And so it becomes a kind of criteria. It has great familiarity, and that means it can be used as a sort of shorthand in many cases. As in some of the instances I gave, the book itself can be just a kind of shorthand for a whole way of life, a whole set of beliefs. But the penalty of familiarity, of course, is invisibility. Things we're very familiar with just, in a way, disappear. Become so taken for granted that it hardly requires that they should be mentioned. And that means that the kind of illusions I've been referring to in some cases would simply be missed by many modern readers, whereas the authors originally could assume that everything was familiar to the reader. To the prayer book also in the earlier part of the period are guarded by a kind of reticence, which again means that they are not really explored other than by a rather reticent kind of illusion, a kind of Anglican sobriety, if you like. Jane Austen's references to church-going or direct allusions to wording in the prayer book are very sparse. The assumption is that Emma, for example, does parish visiting. I mean, we assume she goes to church, but the main reason we assume she goes to church is the occasion when she doesn't go to church, which is, if I remember rightly, is the weather is so bad that she has a good excuse not to go to church and meet Mr. Elton, the vicar, which would be very embarrassing because he's just made a proposal to her which she's had to turn down. So it would be embarrassing to go to church, but happily the weather is bad enough to justify her not appearing. So it can be deduced from that she normally would be there, but not in this case. As the novel develops, the other point, I think, is that the services become possible settings, and as people feel freer to explore them as settings, as dramatic settings, the novelist can assume that the fixed form of the service is familiar to people, and he can concentrate upon and explore the attitudes of the worshippers. There isn't any need to quote from the service. Everybody who is reading is expected to know it, so the novelist concentrates rather on physical sensations, inattentions, the manner and bearing of the minister, and so on. Prayer continues to be a standard, but coming in is which is really the novelist's work, is it not? Is to show how the words and services of the prayer book are refracted and diffused through the different consciousnesses of those attending them. And for a novelist, and in life, I take it, the prayer book doesn't, as it were, just exist in itself. It exists as it is refracted and diffused through innumerable different kinds of consciousness. It can irradiate a whole life, or it can just pass across people's minds with little effect, and the novelists, as they explore it, reflect that fact. The more modern period reflects a further erosion of reticence, as I've suggested, so that something like Holy Communion, which would have been considered too sacred an area to explore, becomes something that can be used novelistically again in the way other services had already been. I think we have to accept that the novel is a secular form. The prayer book can be in it, but there's a sense in which it is relativized within a novel. This does, I suppose, reflect life. The prayer book is part of our lives, but there are many other things in our lives, and novels represent how the prayer book and the services of the church interact with other parts of our lives. And very often within novels there is a multiplicity of points of view, senses of consciousness, which means that you couldn't, as it were, have a prayer book novel in the fullest sense. It's written simply from the point of view of the prayer book. It is necessarily reflected through a multitude of consciousnesses. And that's part of the capacity of the novel. Is this erosive in itself? Can there be Christian novels, indeed? A question which has been raised. Those are questions too large for this occasion. But I do think it does sometimes happen, as I've suggested with Mansfield Park and Silas Marner, that the prayer book can be central in the novelist's articulation of particular themes. And when this happens, it's quite striking. There may be modern novels that I don't know which do this too. It strikes me that liturgical change could be made a very interesting subject of a novel as standing for wider kind of conflicts about change and modernity. Whether anyone's done that, I don't know. You may be able to tell me. So the modern situation, in summary, is one where all this familiarity has changed. People aren't familiar like this now with the prayer book. You can see that reflected in the notes to editions of classic novels. 40 or 50 years ago, it was hardly thought necessary to say that something was alluding to the prayer book. Now it may be that the editor actually simply misses that an allusion is being made to the prayer book and doesn't annotate it for that reason. That is a change within not much more than a generation. 40 or 50 years ago, that sense of familiarity of the prayer book being a great object was still there. Now it is not, and we've been hearing how for some people it's a wholly new discovery, something they hadn't come across before at all. And it's one of the felicities of a conference like this that it brings together those who have been brought up within the old familiarity, which is reflected in much of our literature, and those who are making a discovery of this as a great object for the first time. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that enlightening account of how the prayer book has been woven into our literature and indeed taken for granted in our literature. I think that's, that's something which I think comes through quite strikingly when one hears accounts of the prayer book from the past, is the way it was taken for granted then, in a way that unfortunately it can't be now. So thank you for bringing that to light. I think to make sure that we all get to chapel in time, I'm going to suggest that if anyone has questions for John, that perhaps you could pose them to him over coffee.
Only easy ones.
I just quick change of topic. I meant to do this yesterday and was reminded that I forgot. I just want to seek your opinions on something by means of a straw poll. And that's, it's come to our attention that there's a particular group of people who are systematically excluded from the conference by virtue of its timing, namely teachers and others engaged in the world of education. And we have not insignificant numbers of those amongst our membership. So, as a hypothetical possibility, I just want to test the minds of those present as to how you would feel if the conference were to be held in August rather than in September, in order to enable people of that type to attend. So I'm going to ask for a show of hands for those who would prefer an August conference, those who prefer September, and those to whom it makes not a lot of difference. So first of all, is there anybody who would prefer August, first of all? If you keep your hands up until I ask you to put them down. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, I think. Is your hand up? No, I don't think so. I think that was 11 or 12. Those who prefer the current September timings. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 could be 8, and those to whom it makes not a lot of difference. Well, thank you for that. I mean, we won't be. I think it's very unlikely that we'll be having it in August next year, but it's something that we'll bear in mind. Thank you for that. So it now just falls to me to say a few thank yous to those who have been involved in organising the conference. Obviously to the college management, the conference organisers at the college, although they're not here to hear me say it. A particular thank you to all those who've been involved in organising the services in chapel, to Daniel Newman, Hilary Rudge, those responsible for the music, those who've led services, read, and isn't the volume of singing fantastic with crowd society members? That is amazing. Thank you also to Chris Widows for videoing us. I should say, I hope no one was too distracted by videoing in chapel this morning. The reason we asked Chris to do that is because some of you will know that we have instructional videos on conducting prayer book services on the website, and the communion service is quite high church, which makes it less useful as an instructional aid to those of a more evangelical bent. And so we thought that having a video of a more low church prayer book communion would be useful to them to put alongside what we already have. So thank you for bearing with us, and thank you very much for doing it. Also thank you to George Redgrave for taking some snaps. If anybody else has got any good photos, please do send them to me via the office as soon as possible, because you never know, one of them might find its way into the magazine. So thank you very much. In a moment, I think you all know who I'm going to thank in a moment, but I just have one more announcement to make, and that's that I'm told that 2 of our conference goers are desperate to make contact with each other and haven't yet succeeded in doing so, namely Fergus, Butler, Galley and Ben Somerville. Now, if you're both here, could you both stand up? So that's right. So you can now. Right. So it now comes to me to thank the person to whom this conference is really due, and without whom none of it would happen, and whose extraordinary care is unparalleled by any other conference that anybody has ever been to. I mean, the conference organiser from the RAU was saying that she's never heard of another conference where the organiser takes so much trouble getting everybody here and then getting everybody home with taxis and all the rest of it. And obviously there's all the hard work that goes on behind the scenes that we never see. And it's very hard to express our gratitude to you, Rosemary. This is only a very small token, as usual. But you're held in the affection and respect of all of us, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. This is the only part of the conference I don't really like.
So I think I will stop there and let us all go and have our coffee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.